7 true and most bizarre horror stories shared by regular people like you and me. Welcome back to Horror Vault Channel. Today, I am going to share with you 7 most bizarre but true horror stories that were earlier shared by regular people like you and me. If you like these stories and want to watch our new upcoming videos, then do subscribe to Horror Vault. So without further delay, let us delve deep into these stories. Story 1. The Cemetery Priest. This story begins on a warm November afternoon in Querétaro, Mexico, during the Day of the Dead celebrations. A woman named Clara and her Aunt Rosa arrive at a bustling cemetery to clean and decorate the grave of Rosa's deceased brother. The cemetery is alive with activity. Families placing marigolds on graves, children playing among the tombstones, and vendors selling food and trinkets near the gates. Clara feels a mix of reverence and unease as they walk through the rows of graves. As they clean the tombstone, an elderly priest approaches them. He is dressed in a tattered black cassock, his face weathered but kind. He offers to pray for Rosa's brother, and she gratefully accepts. The priest recites an Ave Maria and a Padre Nuestro with solemnity, sprinkling holy water from a small bottle that appears old and worn. Clara notices that the water has a strange greenish tint, but dismisses it as her imagination. After concluding the prayers, Rosa offers to pay the priest, but he declines with a gentle smile, saying, "Pray for those who serve the church." He blesses them and walks away into the crowd. Clara feels an odd chill as she watches him disappear among the graves. The storm. As Clara and Rosa prepare to leave, dark clouds gather overhead, and rain begins to fall heavily. They take shelter in the small chapel within the cemetery. Inside, they find others waiting out the storm, an elderly couple lighting candles, and a young mother calming her restless child. Clara decides to explore while they wait for the rain to subside. In one of the side rooms of the chapel, she discovers a gallery of portraits depicting priests who had served at the cemetery over the years. The photographs are old and faded, their frames covered in dust. As she scans the faces, her breath catches. One of the portraits shows the same elderly priest who had prayed for them earlier. His nameplate reads Father Santiago, 1885 to 1940. Confused, Clara calls Rosa over. "That's him," Clara whispers. "The priest who prayed for us." Rosa stares at the portrait in disbelief. "That's impossible," she says. "He's been dead for decades." Unraveling mysteries. The storm clears, but Clara can't shake her unease. Over dinner that evening, she tells her family about what happened at the cemetery. Her grandmother listens intently before revealing an old family story. Father Santiago was once beloved in their community, but died under mysterious circumstances during his service at the cemetery. According to legend, Father Santiago had been deeply devoted to his parishioners, often performing blessings and exorcisms for those who sought his help. One fateful night, he was called to perform an exorcism on a young boy possessed by an unknown entity. The ritual went horribly wrong. The boy died during the exorcism, and Father Santiago was found dead in his quarters later that night. Some claim his spirit never left the cemetery because he felt guilt over failing to save the boy's soul. Others believe he continues to protect those who visit out of his enduring sense of duty. The haunting. Unable to let go of what happened, Clara returns to the cemetery alone a few days later. She brings flowers for Father Santiago's grave, but struggles to find it among the many tombstones. As dusk falls, she finally locates it near an old oak tree. To her surprise, there are fresh marigolds on his grave despite no one being around. Suddenly, Clara hears soft footsteps behind her. She turns to see Father Santiago standing a few feet away, his expression calm but sorrowful. "Why are you here?" he asks gently. Clara stammers out her confusion about seeing him alive when he should be long dead. "I am here because I must be," he replies cryptically before vanishing into thin air. Terrified yet intrigued, Clara seeks out records about Father Santiago at the local church archives. She learns that after his death, sightings of his ghost became common during Day of the Dead celebrations. Witnesses described him performing blessings or comforting grieving families before disappearing without explanation. Climactic encounter. Determined to uncover more, Clara visits the cemetery again on All Souls Day with Rosa by her side. This time, they bring candles and prayers specifically for Father Santiago's soul. As they light their candles near his grave at midnight, an icy wind sweeps through the cemetery despite it being a calm night. The figure of Father Santiago appears before them once more, but this time he seems distressed. "You must stop," he pleads. "Your prayers awaken things best left undisturbed before they can respond." Shadows begin to move unnaturally among the graves. Whispering voices grow louder around them as spectral figures emerge from the darkness, restless spirits drawn by their prayers. Father Santiago raises his hands and chants in Latin, creating a protective barrier around Clara and Rosa as malevolent entities close in on them. His form flickers like a dying flame as he struggles against their overwhelming presence. With one final effort, he banishes the spirits back into their graves, but collapses afterward into a heap of ashes where he once stood. Resolution. Clara and Rosa leave shaken but unharmed. They later return with flowers for Father Santiago's grave, but find it completely overgrown, as if untouched for years. No sign of their previous visits remains, though still haunted by what they experienced. Clara feels grateful for Father Santiago's sacrifice and vows to honor his memory by sharing his story with others. Story 2. The Christ of the Afflicted. This second story begins in Hermosillo, Sonora, in the early 1990s. A mother, Senora Elena, is seen lighting candles in a small chapel dedicated to El Cristo de los Afligidos, the Christ of the Afflicted. The chapel is adorned with flowers and offerings from those who have prayed for miracles. Above the altar stands a life-size statue of Christ, depicted in agony on the cross, his face carved with haunting sorrow. This statue has become legendary in Hermosillo after a miraculous story tied to Senora Elena's son. Years earlier, her son survived a devastating car accident on the treacherous La Rumorosa highway, a stretch of road infamous for its sharp turns and deep ravines. Rescuers had found wreckage scattered across a canyon, but miraculously discovered her son alive, though gravely injured. Senora Elena attributed his survival to her fervent prayers to the Christ figure. In gratitude, she commissioned the construction of this chapel and donated the statue. As Elena prays, she whispers her gratitude but also her worries. Her health has been failing, and she fears leaving her family behind. Elena's granddaughter, Sophia, a skeptical young woman in her late 20s, reluctantly accompanies her grandmother to the chapel every year on the anniversary of the miracle. Sophia respects her grandmother's faith, but views it as superstition. This year feels different. Elena appears weaker than ever, and Sophia begins to feel uneasy about what lies ahead. The chapel is packed with worshippers that day. As Sophia helps her grandmother light candles, an elderly woman approaches them and whispers cryptically, "He cries for all of us." Confused, Sophia looks at the Christ statue but sees nothing unusual. The first omen. That evening, as Sophia helps Elena back home, she notices her grandmother staring at something outside their window. When Sophia asks what she sees, Elena replies softly, "He's crying again." Sophia dismisses it as exhaustion or a hallucination caused by Elena's illness. Later that night, Sophia dreams of the Christ statue weeping blood. In her dream, she hears faint whispers warning her to protect her grandmother. She wakes up drenched in sweat, but brushes it off as stress. The crying Christ. The next day, Sophia accompanies Elena back to the chapel from Massachusetts. During the service, Sophia notices several people staring intently at the Christ statue. Whispers ripple through the congregation. He's crying. Skeptical but curious, Sophia moves closer to investigate. To her shock, she sees thin red streaks running down the statue's face, tears of blood trickling from its eyes. The priest tries to calm everyone by explaining it could be condensation mixed with rust from old paint. However, Many worshippers fall to their knees in prayer, convinced it is a divine sign. Sophia feels an overwhelming sense of dread as she watches her grandmother smile faintly and whisper, "It's not for me. It's for you." Unexplained phenomena. Over the following days, strange occurrences plague Sophia's life. At night, she hears faint sobbing echoing through her apartment. Objects in her home move inexplicably. A rosary left on a table falls to the floor despite no breeze. She finds muddy footprints leading from her front door to her bedroom window, but no signs of an intruder. Sophia begins having vivid nightmares where she sees herself standing before El Cristo de los Affligidos, who reaches out to touch her forehead with his bloodied hand. Each time she wakes up gasping for air, seeking answers, desperate for answers, Sophia confides in Father Mateo, the priest at the chapel. He listens carefully and tells her about similar stories tied to El Cristo de los Affligidos. Some believe that when he cries blood, it is a warning of impending tragedy or danger for those who witness it. Father Mateo advises Sophia to pray and seek solace in faith, but she remains skeptical. Instead, she decides to research the history of the statue and discovers chilling accounts. Years ago, a man who mocked El Cristo de los Affligidos during one of its crying episodes died mysteriously in his sleep. Another woman claimed to see him cry before losing her child in an accident. Survivors often reported seeing visions or experiencing unexplained phenomena afterward. Sophia becomes increasingly paranoid as these stories mirror her own experiences. Climactic encounter. One stormy night, Sophia wakes up to find her bedroom flooded with an eerie red glow. Standing at the foot of her bed is El Cristo de los Affligidos, his eyes weeping blood as he reaches out toward her. Frozen with fear, Sophia hears his voice, not aloud but inside her mind, warning her that someone close to her is in grave danger. As thunder crashes outside, he vanishes into thin air. Sophia rushes to check on Elena and finds her unconscious on the floor. Panicking, she calls an ambulance and accompanies Elena to the hospital. Doctors reveal that Elena suffered a stroke, but miraculously survived without lasting damage. A rarity given her age and condition. Resolution. Elena recovers slowly but credits El Cristo de los Affligidos for saving her life once again. For Sophia, however, this experience leaves more questions than answers. While grateful for her grandmother's recovery, she cannot shake off what she saw or heard that night. She returns to the chapel one final time before leaving Hermosillo and stands before El Cristo de los Affligidos. This time, instead of fear or skepticism, she feels a strange sense of peace as she whispers, "Thank you." As Sophia walks away from the chapel under a crimson sunset, faint sobbing can be heard echoing through its walls. Whether from worshippers or something else remains unknown. Story 3. The Black Christ. Our story number 3 begins in a small rural town in Mexico, where the Lopez family has recently moved into an old colonial-style house. The family consists of Rosa, a devout mother, her husband Miguel, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Lucia and 8-year-old Diego. Rosa, deeply religious, decorates the house with religious artifacts, including a crucifix she purchased at a market during their visit to a nearby church. The crucifix is unusual. It is entirely black, from the cross to the figure of Christ. Rosa places the crucifix in the children's shared bedroom, believing it will protect them. However, Lucia feels uneasy about it from the start. The Black Christ seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, and she feels as though its hollow eyes are following her. The first encounter, the first night after hanging the crucifix, strange things begin to happen. Lucia wakes up to find Diego sitting upright in bed, staring at the crucifix. When she shakes him awake, he says he was dreaming of shadows moving around their room. Dismissing it as a nightmare, Lucia comforts him and they go back to sleep. The next morning, Rosa notices that the crucifix has shifted slightly on the wall. She assumes it was knocked loose and adjusted back into place. Escalation. Over the next few nights, the disturbances grow worse. Lucia hears faint whispers at night, but cannot make out any words. Diego begins sleepwalking and is found standing in front of the crucifix with his arms outstretched. Objects in their room move inexplicably. A toy car rolls across the floor on its own. Books fall off shelves despite no wind or movement. One night, Lucia wakes up to see shadows crawling across the walls and ceiling. They seem to emanate from the crucifix itself. She screams, waking up her parents. Miguel inspects the room, but finds nothing unusual. Rosa insists on praying over the crucifix every night, believing it will ward off any evil presence. However, this only seems to make things worse. The black shadows. One evening, while Rosa and Miguel are out running errands, Lucia and Diego are left alone in the house. As they play in their room, the temperature suddenly drops. The lights flicker before going out completely. In the darkness, they see glowing red eyes appear on the figure of Christ on the crucifix. Terrified, they run to the living room, but are stopped by a dark shadow blocking their path. The shadow grows larger and more menacing as it moves toward them. It whispers their names in a distorted voice. Lucia, Diego. Just as it reaches them, Rosa and Miguel return home. Turning on the lights seems to dispel the shadow momentarily. But both children are left shaken, seeking help, desperate for answers. Rosa visits Father Gabriel at their local church. She brings him the crucifix and explains what has been happening. Father Gabriel examines it closely and grows pale as he notices strange markings carved into its back, symbols associated with occult practices. He tells Rosa that this crucifix may have been cursed or used in dark rituals before falling into her hands. He agrees to perform a blessing over it, but warns that such objects often carry lingering malevolent energy that cannot always be cleansed. Climactic confrontation. That night, Father Gabriel visits their home to bless not only the crucifix but also each room of the house. As he begins his prayers in Lucia and Diego's bedroom, an oppressive force fills the air. The shadows return, this time more aggressive than ever. The crucifix begins to shake violently on its hook before flying across the room and shattering against a wall. From its broken pieces emerges a towering shadow figure with glowing red eyes, the embodiment of whatever evil had been tied to the object. Father Gabriel commands everyone to kneel and pray as he confronts the entity with holy water and scripture. The shadow lets out an ear-piercing scream that shatters windows throughout the house. It lunges toward Diego, but is stopped by an invisible barrier created by Father Gabriel's prayers. After what feels like hours of battle, but is only minutes in reality, Father Gabriel manages to banish the entity back into darkness. The house falls silent once more. Resolution. The next morning, Father Gabriel advises Rosa and Miguel to bury what remains of the crucifix far away from their home and never speak of it again. He also suggests they continue praying regularly as a family to strengthen their faith against any lingering negativity. Though life slowly returns to normal for the Lopez family, Lucia occasionally feels as though she is being watched when she walks past certain parts of their home. She avoids looking at shadows for too long and always keeps her rosary close. Story 4. The Scarecrow Man. Story number 4 begins in a small rural village in Mexico during Holy Week. A young boy named Daniel, around 10 years old, is sitting with his grandmother, Dona Rosa, on their porch as the sun sets. The air is warm, and the faint sound of church bells echoes in the distance. Dona Rosa is weaving palm fronds for Palm Sunday, while recounting an old local legend to Daniel, the tale of El Señor Espinapajeros, the Scarecrow Man. She describes him as a tall, shadowy figure dressed in black, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscures his face. His eyes glow like embers in the dark, and he roams the cornfields during Holy Week, bringing misfortune to those who cross his path. They say he comes out at night when the moon is full. She whispers, "If you see him, you must never look into his eyes or follow him into the fields." Daniel listens intently but dismisses it as just another one of his grandmother's scary stories meant to keep him from wandering too far at night. The first signs. As Holy Week progresses, strange things begin happening in the village. Livestock are found dead in their pens, crops wilt overnight, and some villagers report hearing eerie whispers coming from the cornfields after dark. The villagers attribute these events to El Señor Espinapajeros, though others brush it off as superstition. One evening, Daniel is playing outside with his cousin Mateo when they notice something unusual near the edge of the cornfield. A tall figure standing perfectly still among the stalks. It appears to be a scarecrow at first glance, but something about its posture feels unnatural. Its head tilts slightly as if watching them. Mateo suggests they investigate, but Daniel hesitates, remembering his grandmother's warning. Before they can decide what to do, Dona Rosa calls them inside for dinner. The encounter. That night, Daniel struggles to sleep. He keeps thinking about the figure in the cornfield. Around midnight, he hears a faint tapping sound on his bedroom window. Gathering his courage, he peeks out and sees nothing but darkness. However, just as he's about to turn away, he notices movement at the edge of the cornfield, a shadowy figure slowly walking toward the house. Terrified, Daniel runs to wake Dona Rosa and tells her what he saw. She grabs her rosary and begins praying aloud while locking all the doors and windows. The tapping resumes, this time louder and more insistent, but when they look outside again, there's no one there. Dona Rosa insists that they stay inside and continue praying until dawn. Escalation. The following day, news spreads that a young boy from a neighboring village has gone missing after wandering into the fields at night. His parents claim they heard him talking to someone outside just before he disappeared. The villagers grow increasingly fearful as more strange events occur. A farmer finds his cornfield completely flattened overnight. Another villager claims to have seen glowing red eyes staring at him from the woods. Dogs bark incessantly at seemingly nothing during the night. Despite these warnings, Mateo convinces Daniel to sneak out with him one evening to see if they can catch a glimpse of El Señor Espinapajeros. Armed with flashlights and sticks for protection, they venture toward the cornfield after sunset. The climax. As they approach the field, an unnatural silence envelopes them. No crickets chirp, no wind rustles through the stalks. Suddenly, their flashlights flicker and die simultaneously. In the darkness, they hear heavy footsteps approaching. A low growl echoes through the field as El Señor Espinapajeros emerges from the shadows. He is taller than they imagined, his black coat billowing despite the still air. His hat casts a shadow over his face, but his glowing red eyes pierce through the darkness. Mateo freezes in terror, while Daniel remembers his grandmother's warning not to look into its eyes. Grabbing Mateo's arm, he whispers for them to run back home. However, Mateo seems entranced by the figure and begins walking toward it despite Daniel's protests. Desperate to save his cousin, Daniel grabs a rock and throws it at El Señor Espinapajeros. The creature lets out an ear-piercing screech that shakes the ground beneath them. Mateo snaps out of his trance long enough for Daniel to pull him away. They sprint back to Dona Rosa's house as El Señor Espinapajeros watches silently from the edge of the field. Resolution. Once safely inside, Dona Rosa scolds them for disobeying her warnings, but quickly shifts her focus to protecting them. She lights candles around the house and prays fervently throughout the night. By morning, news arrives that another villager has gone missing. A young man who was last seen near the cornfields after dark. The villagers band together to search for him, but find no trace other than footprints leading deep into the fields before abruptly stopping. Dona Rosa decides it's time to take action. She gathers other elders from the village who remember stories about El Señor Espinapajeros and organizes a cleansing ritual at the edge of the cornfield. They burn sage and sprinkle holy water while reciting prayers for protection. Although some villagers remain skeptical, others feel a sense of relief after participating in the ritual.
In the weeks that follow, life in the village begins returning to normal. Livestock stop dying mysteriously, crops recover their vitality, and no more villagers go missing. However, Daniel can't shake off what he saw that night. One evening, as he sits on the porch with Dona Rosa again, she reminds him that some legends are rooted in truth and serve as warnings rather than mere stories. As she speaks, Daniel glances toward the cornfield and notices something unsettling, a lone scarecrow standing among the stalks where none had been before. Story 5. The Disappearing Beggar. Our story number 5 begins on a warm Good Friday afternoon in Mexico City. The Garcia family, comprised of Marta, her husband Luis, their teenage daughter Sofia, and Marta's elderly mother Dona Teresa, are gathered at their home preparing a simple meal to commemorate the solemn day. The family has always observed Good Friday with reverence, avoiding meat and spending the day in quiet reflection. As they sit down to eat, they hear a faint knock at the gate. Luis gets up to check and finds an elderly beggar standing outside. The man is frail, dressed in tattered clothes and holding a small wooden cane. His face is weathered but kind, with eyes that seem to hold a deep sadness. He asks softly for food or water. Moved by his humility, Marta prepares a plate of food while Sofia brings him a glass of water. Luis hands the items to the man, who thanks them profusely and blesses their family before walking away. They watch as he slowly disappears down the street. The first omen. Later that evening, as the family gathers in the living room to pray the rosary, Dona Teresa suddenly grows quiet and stares at the front door. When Marta asks what's wrong, Teresa whispers, "He hasn't left." Confused, Marta looks outside, but sees no one. That night, Sofia has a vivid dream in which she sees the beggar standing in their garden. He is no longer frail but tall and imposing, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He points toward the house and whispers something Sofia cannot understand before vanishing into thin air. Sofia wakes up in a cold sweat but decides not to tell her parents, fearing they'll dismiss it as her imagination. The disappearance. The next morning, Marta decides to take food to a nearby church that runs a soup kitchen for the homeless. She mentions the beggar from the previous day to one of the volunteers, who looks puzzled and says no one matching his description has been seen in the area. Feeling uneasy, Marta asks around the neighborhood but receives similar responses. No one else saw an elderly beggar walking through their street on Good Friday. Later that evening, as Luis takes out the trash, he notices faint footprints leading from their gate toward their front door. The prints are small and barefoot, as though left by someone walking through mud. However, there hasn't been any rain recently. When he tells Marta about it, she brushes it off as kids playing outside earlier in the day. But Luis can't shake off his unease. The painting. On Easter Sunday, after attending Mass with her family, Sofia notices something unusual at a small religious goods stall outside the church. Among various paintings of saints and biblical scenes is one that catches her eye. It depicts Jesus kneeling beneath the cross while being comforted by an angel. In the background stands a figure that looks strikingly similar to the beggar they helped on Good Friday. Sofia calls her parents over to see it. Marta gasps audibly when she recognizes him too. The vendor explains that this particular painting is called El Mendigo de Dios, the beggar of God, inspired by a legend about Jesus appearing as a beggar to test people's kindness during Holy Week. Overwhelmed by this revelation, Marta buys the painting and brings it home to hang in their living room. The climax. That night, strange occurrences begin in their home. Doors creak open on their own. Faint whispers echo through hallways. The smell of incense fills rooms despite no candles being lit. As these events escalate, Dona Teresa insists that they pray together in front of the painting for protection. During their prayers, Sofia notices that the figure of the beggar in the painting seems more vivid than before. His eyes now appear alive and watchful. Suddenly, all lights in the house flicker and go out simultaneously. In complete darkness, they hear heavy footsteps approaching from outside. Terrified but determined to protect her family, Marta grabs a rosary and begins reciting prayers aloud. The footsteps stop abruptly at their front door before fading away into silence. When Luis checks outside moments later, he finds no one there, but muddy footprints are once again visible on their porch. Resolution. The next morning, Marta contacts Father Ignacio from their parish to bless their home and provide guidance. After hearing their story, He explains that such encounters are rare, but not unheard of during Holy Week, a time believed to be spiritually significant when divine or supernatural forces may manifest. Father Ignacio performs a blessing ritual throughout their house and prays over the painting. He advises them to keep it as a reminder of God's presence and mercy, but also warns them never to ignore acts of kindness towards strangers. From that day forward, peace returns to their home. The Garcia family continues displaying El Mendigo de Dios prominently in their living room as both a symbol of faith and a reminder of their mysterious encounter. This particular story ends with Sophia visiting the same church years later during Holy Week. As she lights a candle near an altar adorned with similar paintings of El Mendigo de Dios, she feels a familiar presence behind her. Turning around quickly, she sees no one, but faint muddy footprints lead away from where she stands. The camera pans out as Sophia smiles softly and whispers, "Thank you." Story 6. The Weeping Virgin. This story number 6 begins in the 1960s as Father Francisco, a young, recently ordained priest trained in both theology and medicine, is assigned to a remote village of fewer than 200 inhabitants. The village is isolated, accessible only by horseback or train. The bishop sends Francisco to this superstitious community to bring them closer to God and dispel their belief in the supernatural. Skeptical of anything beyond science and faith, Francisco reluctantly accepts his mission. Upon arriving, Francisco is warmly welcomed by the villagers, who are eager for his guidance. The village is humble, with a small chapel made of sticks. Over time, Francisco earns the trust of the community by helping with medical needs and improving their chapel. Despite hearing rumors of supernatural beings like duendes, goblins, and Nawal's shapeshifters, he dismisses them as folklore. The legend emerges. As Holy Week approaches, excitement fills the village. The villagers prepare for their first grand celebration of Easter under Francisco's leadership. However, during preparations for Good Friday, a young boy innocently asks Francisco if he can stop the Weeping Virgin from coming. Confused, Francisco questions the boy and learns about a local legend. Every Good Friday night, after sunset, a spectral figure known as the Weeping Virgin appears in the fields near the village. Her mournful cries are said to hypnotize children and young men before she takes them away into the darkness.
The villagers recount past incidents. 2 boys disappeared on consecutive Good Fridays. One was only 10 years old. The other was 25. Both were last seen entranced by her cries before vanishing without a trace. Despite their warnings, Francisco remained skeptical, attributing their fears to superstition. Good Friday night. On Good Friday evening, ominous clouds gather as the villagers finish their religious observances. A palpable tension fills the air as they rush home before nightfall. An elderly woman warns Francisco to stay indoors and not venture out under any circumstances. As night falls, an eerie silence envelopes the village. No insects chirp, no frogs croak. Alone in his quarters, Francisco begins to hear faint sobbing in the distance. Initially dismissing it as wind through the trees, he soon realizes it is unmistakably human. A sorrowful lament filled with despair. Gripping his rosary tightly, Francisco steps outside to investigate. In the moonlit fields, he sees her. A tall, gaunt figure draped in black with an aura of darkness emanating from her form. She appears otherworldly yet maternal as she stands over a young boy from the village who seems entranced by her cries. The confrontation. Francisco approaches cautiously while reciting prayers aloud. As he gets closer, he notices her hollow eyes, black voids leaking blood-like tears, and her skeletal hand reaching toward the boy. Despite his prayers and attempts to intervene, an invisible force prevents him from getting closer. The Weeping Virgin lets out an ear-piercing wail that causes everyone nearby to cover their ears in agony. She lifts the boy tenderly into her arms and disappears into the dense forest as if swallowed by shadows. The villagers emerge from their homes too late to stop her. They find only the boy's distraught mother collapsed on the ground. Despite an extensive search led by Francisco and other villagers over several months, No trace of the boy is ever found. Aftermath. Haunted by his failure to save the child and shaken by what he witnessed, Francisco reports the incident to his bishop. However, without evidence beyond testimonies from frightened villagers, church authorities dismiss his account as hysteria or hallucination. Determined not to abandon his flock, Francisco remains in the village and institutes strict rules for future Good Fridays. No one is allowed outside after sunset. Families must gather indoors for prayer until dawn. Over time, these precautions reduce further disappearances. Though skeptical at first, Father Francisco comes to accept that some phenomena lie beyond human understanding, forces that neither science nor faith alone can fully explain. Years later, as the village grows and prospers under his care, new families are warned about the Weeping Virgin. Some dismiss it as legend. Others take heed without question. Yet every Good Friday night, when silence falls over the fields and shadows stretch unnaturally long under moonlight, those who remember dare not tempt fate. The camera pans out on Father Francisco standing at the chapel door one Good Friday night with his rosary in hand, watching over his people as they pray inside, while faint sobbing echoes once more from somewhere deep within the forest. Story 7. The Texas Encounter. The story number 7 begins in November, as Artemio Salazar, a man in his early 30s, travels from Texas to Guanajuato, Mexico, to visit his family in the picturesque town of San Felipe. Artemio is deeply religious and makes it a tradition to visit the Cristo Rey statue on Mount Cubolite whenever he is in Guanajuato. This time, his nephews join him for the pilgrimage. The journey to Cristo Rey is exhausting, but spiritually fulfilling. After hours of hiking and prayer, they return home late in the evening. Artemio's family house is an old structure with thick adobe walls, located on the outskirts of town. That night, Artemio offers his bed to his nephews and decides to sleep on the floor near the door for comfort. The windows and doors are left open to let in the cool breeze. The first encounter. Around midnight, as Artemio lies awake scrolling through his phone, he senses movement behind the curtain covering the door. The faint moonlight reveals a tall figure standing outside. Startled, Artemio freezes. The figure appears unnaturally large, its shadow stretching across the room. He quickly pulls the blanket over himself, praying silently until he falls asleep. The next morning, Artemio dismisses the incident as a trick of his imagination caused by exhaustion. However, a lingering unease follows him throughout the day. The second encounter. Months later, during spring break in March, Artemio returns to Guanajuato for another visit. This time, he stays alone in his room. The memory of the shadowy figure has faded from his mind. As he prepares for bed one night, he leaves the door and window open again to enjoy the cool air. At around 12:30 a.m., he feels a sudden drop in temperature and hears faint footsteps entering his room. Assuming it's his mother checking on him, he lifts his head, but no one is there. He shrugs it off and turns away from the door. Moments later, he hears heavy footsteps leaving the room, dragging across the floor as if someone is struggling to walk. Fear grips him as he realizes that whatever entered his room has returned. This time, he knows it isn't human. A strong gust of wind blows through the room as thunder rumbles outside. The air grows cold and damp as if a storm is brewing. Artemio begins to pray under his breath when he notices something dripping onto his face from above. Looking up at the ceiling, he sees muddy footprints, barefoot impressions that seem impossible given their location directly above him. The black crucifix. Terrified, Artemio grabs his phone and prepares to flee when something catches his eye on the bedside table. A small wooden crucifix with a black Christ figure hanging from it. The crucifix appears wet and gleams faintly in the dim light. He recalls that this crucifix was purchased by his mother as a souvenir during their visit to Cristo Rey months earlier. However, when she gave it to him, it had been an ordinary wooden cross without any figure attached. Artemio bolts out of the room and wakes his mother in tears. He tells her about what happened, but omits details about the crucifix out of fear of alarming her further. She reassures him and invites him to sleep in her room for the rest of the night. The investigation. The next morning, Artemio and his mother inspect his room together. To their surprise, there are no muddy footprints on the ceiling or any signs of water damage. However, when they examine the crucifix on his bedside table, it has reverted back to its original form, a plain wooden cross with no figure attached. Confused but determined to find answers, Artemio visits local clergy members to seek guidance. One priest suggests that objects purchased at religious sites can sometimes carry spiritual energy, both good and bad, depending on how they were made or blessed. Climactic encounter. That night, Artemio decides to confront whatever entity has been haunting him. Armed with holy water and prayers taught by the priest earlier that day, he returns to his room and places the crucifix prominently on his bedside table. At midnight, a violent wind shakes the house as thunder roars outside. The temperature plummets again as shadows begin to gather in one corner of the room. Slowly, they coalesce into a towering figure. Its features obscure, but its presence undeniably malevolent. Artemio begins reciting prayers aloud while sprinkling holy water toward the entity. The figure recoils but doesn't retreat entirely. Instead, it lets out a guttural growl that shakes the walls. Summoning all his courage, Artemio grabs the crucifix and holds it high while continuing to pray fervently. The black Christ figure reappears on the cross, as if drawn by some unseen force. A blinding light erupts from it, filling the room with warmth and dispelling every shadow. When Artemio opens his eyes again, he finds himself alone in silence, the entity gone without a trace. Resolution. From that day forward, Artemio keeps the crucifix close at all times, but never experiences another paranormal encounter in that house again. Though shaken by what happened, he feels a renewed sense of faith and gratitude for having survived such an ordeal. He continues visiting Cristo Rey during every trip to Guanajuato, but now approaches these pilgrimages with greater reverence and caution than ever before. This story ends with Artemio placing flowers at an altar near Cristo Rey during one of his visits years later. As he walks away from the shrine at sunset, a faint shadow crosses behind him, a reminder that some mysteries remain unsolved but are best left undisturbed. That's the end, guys. Don't forget to subscribe to Horror Vault to keep listening to our new and unique true horror stories. I will see you in the next video.